the valley was gone. We feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the stars and drink our breakfast.
Hello and welcome to episode 49 of God's Own Scale podcast. I am Sean Clark, your host. God's Own Scale podcast is sponsored by Coat d'Arms Paints and produced in association with Bacchus Miniatures and Pendragon Miniatures. This is another episode where there's no pre-ramble, apart from this, or post-ramble. It's a chat with Henry, Turner and Robert Dunlop about the Europe Asunder, the Great War Kickstarter, which has, as of today, as of release day, has 6 days to run. The pre-ramble and post-ramble will return for episode 50, and I'm making plans for something a bit different to celebrate my half century of podcasts. As always, though, thanks for listening, and let's talk about six.
Mademoiselle from Armentier, save to you. Sing it with all your heart and soul and see everyone right up the pole. Mademoiselle from Armentier.
Hello and welcome to episode 49 of God's Own Scale podcast. I use this phrase quite a lot, but I'm going to use it again. This is quite a special podcast because I have two previous guests with me. One appearing for the second time, one for the third time. I think there's a long service medal in it for three-time appearances. That's not great English. But first of all, I've got Mr. Henry Turner. How are you, Henry?
Hello, I'm very well. Just sitting around in sunny Mexico.
Can you just go into a bit more detail about your current position?
As CEO of Turner Miniatures, or
no, I'm thinking about
position.
Yeah, you're inside inside some sort of bag, aren't you, or to improve the audio?
Yes, I hope that the listeners are enjoying this crisp audio quality, because I was told that I'm echoing a bit today, so I'm speaking to you with my head inside a bag, which I'm told is best for everyone concerned, especially the onlookers. So,
well, you're in a public space, aren't you? So
yes,
I've got this image of you in Mexico with your head in a bag. But anyway, we won't get distracted down that line.
It's a wonderful opening.
Yes, well, this is the kind of content that the listeners come to expect, I think, of God's Own Scale as we approach 50 episodes. The other guest I have is the third time appearance for Mr. Robert Dunlop. How are you, Robert?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Good, thanks, Sean. I am being told I should have my head in a bag. But that's another story.
That's very unkind. Well,
you never heard the compliment face for radio before, did you?
I live by that mantra, actually. I was at a war game show at the weekend called Partisan in Nottingham, and I had a discussion with one or two other content creators and made it clear that I'm quite happy with my face for radio. It's why I don't do a video call, we just do audio. I've described this episode as special, not only because of the quality of the guests that I have with me tonight, but for the subject matter, which is returning to Kickstarters and 3D printing and STL files and all that sort of goodness. Well, as I say goodness, it's stuff that absolutely scares me to death. But, Henry, we last spoke when you were releasing the Europe Asunder Napoleonic Kickstarter.
Mm-hmm.
But you've something different for us now. Can you tell us about it?
I've moved on from shakos, as you know. After about 6-9 months of staring at tall pieces of headwear, you kind of want to move on to something different. And I've decided to shake the stick at trying a more modern conflict, but still one that I think is rather underrepresented. Lots of World War II stuff floating around, obviously, but I think the First World War, at least to me personally, is much more interesting. I won't get into some historical diatribe about it being because Germany actually had a chance of winning or anything like that, unlike World War II. But it's it's that wonderful crossroads, isn't it, between modern conflict but still having some of the pageantry and like the variety in unit types, costumes, and so on that just makes it really fun to work with, especially something that you're customizing a lot. And I did promise myself that when I appeared here, I would be plugging the versatility of what we're covering for modeling other wars as well. I'm sure we'll discuss this later, but we've got all kinds of like colonial troops, niche items like French zouaves, fezzes. So yeah, it's just a wonderful period for tackling something modern, but also with just a lot of just fun aesthetics. And for me as a war gamer, at least the aesthetics are what I enjoy most. So.
And just to be clear, the Kickstarter is called Europe Asunder: The Great War, and from what I've seen so far, you're covering most of it, or certainly most of the nations involved.
Yeah, I've taken a bit of a shortcut in that some of the Eastern and Balkan states are only being represented with Blender assets. Basically, I'm saying to people, do it yourself, export them instead. But yes, I think I did promise one fellow that I would add the Greeks. I forgot to do that. That's just come to me now. But yeah, except for like the Greeks, I think we do have every major player at least. What is it off the top of my head? Well, we've got STLs for Germany, France, and Great Britain in their early war, mid-war, late war appearances. Austria-Hungary, Italy, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Anzacs, Brits, both like Western Front Brits, but also like in overseas dress. And Arabs we've unlocked now. No, sorry, we haven't unlocked the irregular Arabs, just regular Arabs, Ottoman Arab infantry, but soon on the stretch goals we have Arab irregulars coming up. And we still need to unlock America and Belgium. But yeah, otherwise, yeah, I think that's the full list. I don't know, Robert, if I've missed any there. But I think that was all of them.
Yeah, I think that covers certainly from the infantry, and then obviously working towards cavalry, and also thinking ahead to some of the vehicles that, particularly those that are underrepresented in other ranges as well.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd have to recommend is everyone pulls up the stretch goal list and just takes a gander there. It's all laid out as clearly as I can do it. But where we are now, we're at about £10,500, so we're currently unlocking various light machine guns and then moving on to artillery crews, artillery pieces. And once we reach about the £16,000 mark, that's when we go on to just unlocking the fun stuff. I am holding out for the Imperial Camel Corps. I think everybody wants to see that, right?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I've got it in front of me, actually. It's very colourful and really clear, because you strike through each goal as you achieve it, which is great, because it's a one-click view of where you are on the Kickstarter. And with the stretch goals, I do find some Kickstarters, it's quite difficult to decipher just what you're getting for your money and what's been released, but this is great.
Oh, well, I'm glad, because a spreadsheet is much easier than the pretty graphics that other people do, with preview renders and these things.
Well, it does the job. You've heard his voice there. So, Robert, you've jumped in to assist Henry with this Kickstarter. Obviously, you're very well known across the wargaming scene for your monumental, epic games that you've put on over the years at the Jurors 6, and you work with Great War Spearhead. How did you become involved with this Kickstarter?
Well, it actually stretches back to a previous podcast, Sean. When you originally interviewed Henry, I'd had some experience with resin printing already, and I had obviously worked on various designs and printed them myself, so things that were relatively easy to create, some of the artillery pieces, for example, or Minenwerfer. But I knew that figures were just going to be beyond me. It's just not my thing to be able to sculpt at that level. And when Henry talked about how he had created the Napoleonic figures and the way he designed them to be able to reuse different components, for example, to be able to maneuver the heads in different directions and really customize figures to a level that just isn't possible with precast figures from, say, the sort of metal ranges or plastic figures. And I was fascinated by it. So I picked up on the Napoleonic Kickstarter and became involved in painting some of the figures, and we just got to chatting, and as we discussed it, Henry said, he was thinking about World War One. So I just made my expertise available and my printer. So really, really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it appears to me as a layperson looking in, quite a monumental effort that both of you have put into this, because although the Great War might be seen as, well, it's just British against German on the Western Front, and there's not much diversity in uniform or equipment type. But goodness me, the stretch goals that you have for this, they're just, well, I was going to say endless. It's not quite endless. There is an end to it. At £25,000 with an armoured train, which I would be delighted to see. That would be incredible. But how long, Henry, did it take you to decide just what you wanted to include with this? Because it just appears all-encompassing.
I've made what might be a bit of a poor business decision, at least as far as competition are concerned, in that I actually have all of my plans public. The links are there on my Discord. So I've made brainstorms for every project I intend to cover. One thing I often link people who write me is my prospective release schedule. It's like a 5-year plan of every Kickstarter I want to make in the next 5 years. And when I was putting that together, every Kickstarter I came up with an idea for, I went in and just brainstormed some content under a model of a core component and 2 optional add-ons. Like that, I want to be very formulaic. I especially think that's good for people who have some kind of, would be right to say, like brand loyalty, who come back and buy repeated Kickstarters because they like the customizer, they like the product. So some consistency there is good. But anyway, I go in there, and for each Kickstarter, I just planned like core and 2 optional modules. And when I took that model to the First World War, it seemed pretty obvious to split it by theatre. And I don't know how much credit to give myself. Like World War One, I'm not really. I guess I'm not a layman, but it's not really my area of expertise. I'm not like Robert, not at all. But it just seems sort of self-evident that people are going to want Gallipoli. And of course, East and Western Front. I think most of us can point to those. And I just kind of took those ideas and ran with them, because the kind of content that you would put in for Gallipoli could also be expanded into the Levant and the Near East. So that's what we did. And Eastern Front, I just lumped together with the Southern Fronts. And part of it then, kind of cunningly, is going through, seeing what other manufacturers who've come before have already modeled themselves. I would like to give a shout out to Plastic Soldier Review, which is perhaps a very strange source to use for your history, but when I was putting together wargaming armies in the past, what I would do is I would always read their reviews, because they had such good insights into like uniform and equipment points. And now they're especially useful, because when I want to model something, I look up another kit on Plastic Soldier Review, and I just read their review and the negative points, and I just take that as my like not what to do list. So yeah, it's a combination of things. It's some planning, pre-brainstorming, and copying what other people have done, and sort of just reading the market, I guess. And I think especially if your product is about modular, customizable miniatures, people are going to want some crazy varied things. I can't remember if I've mentioned this already, but I'm really hoping people will use these blended files like for 1890s kind of colonial conflicts, or even adapting them perhaps beyond World War One. I think you could do some early World War Two stuff with this. On the Kickstarter page, I have a Chinese warlords model that I've cobbled together after someone on the Discord suggested it. So, yeah, I don't know. I think that's the most long-winded way I could have answered that question.
Not at all. I want to talk about Blender shortly. I know we spoke about that on the previous podcast, but Robert, I just wondered. I know you've got quite a setup there for printing, and you've learnt the art of printing these models out. Just for the you'd have to live under a rock, I think, not to be aware of what 3D printing is and STL files are. But just for the lay person, just go through what that is. What is an STL, for instance?
So an STL file is a file that is generated by software that is used to create three-dimensional figures or vehicles or designs of any description. And with an STL file, you can upload it into what's called a slicer application, piece of software that sets up that three-dimensional description into something that a printer can print as a series of layers, very, very thin layers that ultimately go to create the three-dimensional figure, typically in resin. And there are other types of files that are very similar. You'll also come across things called OBJ files. They all do the same thing, basically. They are generated by different 3D software applications, but they all do the same basic job of creating this description in computer language of a three-dimensional object, which you can then put through a printer.
Okay, so do they take any particular IT skills to use? Is it something that a beginner could jump right in with, as long as they got a half-decent printer and some STL files? Could they be producing their own figures relatively quickly?
Well, this is where I think the way Henry has thought about and created the STL files is really impressive. It's possible, yes, to take something literally off the shelf and print it if the three-dimensional figure or object is designed in such a way that the printer can handle it without you having to go in and make tweaks to it. If you're printing something in layers, you've got to be very careful that suddenly out of nowhere you start printing a layer that has no supports to be able to hold it. So for example, if you've got a figure that's standing, then that's great because the feet then support the legs, support the lower part of the body. But if, for example, the arm is off to one side and bent, the elbow suddenly appears as one of the layers, and if it hasn't got a support that props it up from the base that you're printing from, you get all sorts of problems. So that's where Henry has thought incredibly carefully about how to create models that are really dynamic and have real character to them, but they don't need somebody to know how to put supports on them. It's a really big step forward and makes it so much easier for somebody who's quite new to this field to be able to just pick it up and run with it, for sure.
I would like to say I owe Robert a tremendous amount of thanks because he went through a lot of STLs that my tired eyes had gone over a few times and not noticed obvious islands on. So thanks so much for that. It's true about the dynamic poses that there is such a world of difference between designing black powder Napoleonic models, because the majority of those models are in a marching pose where I can have the left hand, say, connected to, left hand or right hand? One of the hands connected to the leg and the other hand holding the musket from underneath and sort of clipping into the torso. So no external support is necessary on the model. But if you've got like a guy who's, say, an officer firing his pistol and the handle of the pistol is coming down beneath his hand that is outstretched, it needs a support. So these are the first 6mm figures I put out that had widespread use of external supports on them. And I have tried to configure them so that they're ready to go without any support work being necessary on the part of the user. But there has been a lot of trial and error with that. On my Facebook group, I had to ask people to do test prints for me, like en masse, just to see if the supports were well placed, if they were thick enough. So this is quite a world of departure from the Napoleonics. It was much trickier to pull off, but it's necessary if you want to have good-looking modern poses rather than people marching in a regimented style.
Yes, because I guess in a 18th or 19th century rank and file army, you don't need as many sort of pose variants. You want that marching pose, and maybe a figure looking to the left or the right, or slightly in a different step. But in modern warfare, particularly something like World War One, you really need as many different poses, don't you, as possible.
I think we have 28 per infantry set. That's including the MG gunner and assistant and officers.
And that's an impressive number, but you mentioned something called the blender. Let's talk about what that does.
Okay, I'll operate under the assumption that people listening haven't necessarily listened to the last time I was on here, so I'll start afresh. Blender is a piece of free 3D design software, which I do all my work in it, but the Blender files that I give for this Kickstarter and my previous project, I've kind of appropriated and configured to work as a sort of custom miniature exporter. And how far you want to go with that, well, it depends on the scope of your ambition, I suppose. At its most basic, you have on the right side of the screen a kind of overview where the models are organized into different folders. And these folders can be toggled on and off. So at the most basic level, I might have, say, a soldier standing ready. And I can toggle off a Pickelhaube and toggle on a German bush hat. And then I have a figure that I could use in the Near East, like the German... Robert, what was the name of the German sent to Palestine?
Oh, yes, the Yildirim.
Yeah, anyway, I want to model them, but yes, that would be a basic example. But otherwise, you could go a step up beyond that, and let's say you don't want to just toggle options on and off, you can move pieces. You might orient the guns around slightly differently. So, for example, with my American Civil War figures, some people like to have the muskets at slightly different angles, just so the marching regiments don't look so uniform. Rotate heads. And if you want to get super ambitious, you can try the sculpting tools, things like the pose brush tool, to change the angles of arms and things. So yeah, I would say it's just these three tiers of difficulty, from the most basic, just toggling parts on and off. And I've tried to put in a huge amount of options for that. There's different legs, different garment types, like single-breasted, double-breasted jackets. Things that can be toggled on and off the hats. For example, the Italians can have some goggles on their Adrian helmets if maybe they're in the Alps or something. Different pieces of facial hair, or just rotating pieces, putting them around. And I do have YouTube tutorials up on how to do this. I do want to apologize, though, to backers of the Napoleonic Cavalry project, because as I've been speaking, I've just remembered I still have not put out a promised tutorial about armature usage. Now that I've publicly conceded that, I hope that's proof I'll have to get to it.
You've made the commitment now.
Yeah. Well, I did promise it, and ultimately, I do make public roadmaps. Every project I do has a public roadmap where everything I've committed to do is listed. People can comment on it. It's a public document, so if they want to remind me of something I've forgotten, they can. But it is out there. It is all public record. Anything I failed to do is in black and white. So if anyone's listening who's back something else and I've forgotten something I haven't remembered, just give me a kick up the butt. I'll get to it. I can be a bit scatty at times.
Robert was very kind to send a package through with samples of half a dozen nations, by the looks of it. I'm struggling to find words, to be honest, to say how nice these are. What strikes me first off is the detail.
I think a lot of it is just the technology, really. I mean, printing I think does more for 6mm than perhaps any other scale, because at best at like 28mm, printers are just trying to sort of rival or achieve parity with existing plastic manufacturers. But at 6mm, you can achieve results with resin printing that, in detail terms at least, arguably, I have to be very diplomatic with my words here, right? But arguably bring out more detail than metal might. Metal obviously still has that very satisfying weight to it. It's nice. I do love metal minis, but that's one advantage it has. But I just wanted to say on the matter of scale, I do market these as being 6 to 15mm. But one thing I think a lot of people don't appreciate about 3D printing is the scaling options you have, even with just an STL, not the Blender file. So we have a public spreadsheet where we have suggested scaling settings where, for example, this is off the top of my head, but if I wanted to print one of the 6mm at, say, 15mm, I could do it as being 200% in size on the z-axis, so height-wise, but only 180% on the x and y axes. So the model is effectively slimmed just a little bit. So if people have problems with the proportions, and I certainly understand that, there are little tweaks you can make. But one kind of problem, I suppose, of trying to bring people on board with this is if you don't have painted examples and you're relying on computer renders, they can be a bit misleading, because you go on the Kickstarter page, you look at these graphics of these large pictures of, say, German World War I infantry, and yes, the heads look bulbous, the hands are oversized, but that's because you're looking at a model that is like under 8mm in height, and you're looking at it taking up half your monitor screen. It's really zoomed in. Of course, it's going to look a bit crazy. The proportions are intended for 6mm. And I did share some renders on one Facebook group. I can't remember which one it was. It was one of the World War I wargaming ones. I think it was the Flames of War Great War group. And this guy just wrote they're so bulbous, they're like dwarves. All I could write was, well, welcome to the world of 6mm, you know, like.
Yes. Yeah, there's. Yeah, I think, as we all know, across any social media platform, there will always be that guy, I think, is the way that we'll mention it. So, Robert, you kindly printed these samples off for me, which are in front of me. Just for the listener, how different is it to deal with these figures as opposed to traditional metal figures, as in how you prepare them, how you paint them, how you use them? What are the differences?
I think there are two major differences. One is the ability to personalize the figures more. So, for example, I can print them out in a long row that is then easy to put on a painting stick. Or I can print them out as individual figures, which I did in the ones I sent you, and I printed them on what's called a raft that allows you to just pop that on, say, a piece of blue tack on the top of some, like a large dowel or something, to be able to paint each individual one. So there's configurability at that level. But I think the other major difference, of course, is that resin has different characteristics to metal. There are different types of resin, of course. But one of the things that you have to be more careful about is removing the supports, for example, that prop bayonets attached to rifles. It just takes a very, very sharp knife and a little bit of extra skill compared to just using side cutters, for example, if you were removing an equivalent piece of flash from a metal figure. The figures themselves, you can drop them, even from great heights, which I have done, and they are very sturdy in that respect. But it's just, to me, it's also the quality, the consistency. There are some manufacturers where you get variations in the size of the figures, and I like the fact that when you print them with resin, they're just a consistent size. Whatever the pose is, you don't get that variation in the figures themselves, which is pleasing.
Any advice in particular for dealing with some of these poses? I.e., not snapping off bayonets? Do you use hot water, or because at this point you've had more hands-on experience than I have with the figures, ironically.
There's two ways of doing it. One is with resin printers, what you're doing is you're taking a bath of resin typically, and then there's some form of external light/heat that enables the resin to be fixed into a solid in these layers that we were talking about before. So in that situation, my particular system uses laser that's focused at a particular point, and it runs backwards and forwards on each layer, and it fuses the resin to make this solid figure. Others use ultraviolet light to do the same thing. But when the figures first come out of the printing process, they're still relatively soft. They need hardening, and some people like to remove the supports at that stage because they will come away quite easily, and often you don't even need to use any sort of cutters at all. With things like bayonets, you have to be somewhat careful, because when you put the figure through what's called the curing process, which hardens the resin to the form that you see, Sean, when you open that parcel, that curing process, obviously, in some cases, what I've seen happen is the bayonet will curve because it doesn't have the support to anchor it. And so typically what I do is I leave the supports on for things like bayonets or equivalent, quite small objects that are very fine in detail. And then I just use a very sharp scalpel and either lay the figure sideways onto the modeling mat. You know how you get these quite large, sort of sometimes green, sometimes blue mats?
Yeah, the cutting mats, yeah.
Yep. So if you lay the figure on its side, you can typically cut down using the mat as the support, and it will allow that to just cut through. Or the other way you do it is you just finally pair it off with a couple of strokes from one side and then the other, and it'll just come away without any problem. So the risk is, if you're not careful, in some cases you can break the bayonet. And that happens with metal figures too, but with resin figures, you just have to be that little bit more careful with those very fine features like that.
I'm clipping the figures from these, did you call them rafts? These sort of bases with the supports on. And I've never handled... no, that's not quite true. I did have some from Aaron at Project Wargaming, but if this kind of material, I've never handled them before, and I've clipped a couple of dozen off in no time. It's and only 2 casualties, but that's just because I'm ham-fisted. They'll end up having been the victim of a mortar shell, I think, at some point. So that's the
great thing is. The great thing is, Sean, you can just whack out a few more.
Yes, yeah. Well, this is the point. Once you've got your STL file from Henry, you could do the BEF in 1:1 scale, I guess.
Absolutely.
Well, let's if we bring out the big guns, Robert, how much would you say it costs per figure? I know in your case it's going to vary from perhaps an ordinary printer. But...
you're talking probably 1/10 of the cost.
Right.
At least it's the cost of the figures, particularly at 6mm, is trivial.
Yeah, so less than a penny.
Oh yeah, well, in some cases it's especially when you print multiple at the same time. It's very, very cost effective.
Negligible, yes. So once you've clipped them off these rafts or and away from the supports, how are you handling these to get them painted? Do you have to wash them? Is there some special undercoat that you use?
You wash the figures after they come out of the printer before they're cured. So that process is quite important because you wash off any uncured resin or any resin that hasn't been semi-hardened by the laser or the UV light. So there's no kind of equivalent of the demolding residue that you can get on figures sometimes.
Yes, yeah.
So basically, once you can either, typically what I do is I leave them on the raft and just make sure I've cleared away any supports, for example, bayonets, as we've discussed. And then it's just a quick, I typically use the Tamiya light grey myself, primer, and from there it's straight into the process of painting. And the quality of the figures is so good that the painting process, using the methods that I've developed, is very straightforward. And part of what I've committed to do for Henry is to create an illustrated guide to painting the World War I figures, similar to what I did for the irregular miniatures figures.
Oh,
I
yes.
think you've seen that guide.
I have, yeah. It's very good, yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned it on air because I'm looking forward to it. Now you've committed to it.
No backing out.
Sorry, you're breaking up, Henry. I can't hear it.
If I could give one piece of advice to anyone who's thinking of picking up a printer, this is like my absolute mandatory. If you listen to any one thing I say, listen to this. Get a wash and cure station, because I didn't, and I learned through pain and tears that it's a world of difference in terms of quality of life in several respects. What do I mean by that? You'll find some guides about printing on a budget will suggest using Tupperware with some alcohol in there and sort of just manually washing your minis. Even if you do a good job of that, you keep the alcohol clean, you replenish it, you get these sticky residues all over the place. It makes everything really intensive. Just spend like the £100 or so on getting an Elegoo wash and cure station. There isn't any cubic one as well, but I don't like it. But what's wonderful about this is you just put it next to your printer. When your print finishes, you take the build plate out. You don't even take the models off. You just put that in the wash and cure station, leave it rinsing for like 5 minutes, and then I get hot water, immerse the build plate in this hot water in like a tub, and then just remove the miniatures, put them in a box, let them dry. It makes everything so much more like a kind of almost factory process versus what was previously a very messy, very labor-intensive approach. So, yes, literally, your first purchase should be your printer, and the second concurrent purchase should be a wash and cure station. I'm not sure if I know Robert has one, but I don't know if he would agree it's so critical. But for me, it was life-changing.
Absolutely. No, totally agree. Otherwise, you end up drinking the alcohol because it's the only way you can stay sane.
And just to be clear, if any manufacturers of 3D printers, because there are more than Elegoo and what was the other one, Robert? Elegoo and
the Anycubic one.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's
quite a few. Yeah.
There's quite a few. If any manufacturers are out there interested in sponsoring a podcast who would gladly take your wares off you and try these things out using Henry's STL files, you know where to contact me. So for this impoverished podcaster. Henry, the sculpting that the 3D design, that you've put into this, what sort of time frame are we talking about to get up all of these various sculpts and designs and bits of equipment?
I began work on this in February. That's when I did my first prototype Tommies, bothering Robert every 30 seconds with some asinine question after another.
He loves it though, don't you, Robert? You love those asinine questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
The thing is, I work on multiple projects at once, so it's kind of difficult to quantify how well I would have worked if it had been full-time, but I would say that if I'm like super motivated, because unfortunately, I don't know, maybe if I'm going to get all pretentious, I could say I'm a creative, you know. Um,
You have to wait for the muse.
yeah, well, no, basically, yes. If I'm highly motivated, I can go in almost like a kind of manic state and crank out a kit within a day. But under normal circumstances, I would say if I'm giving it my full time, then I need 2 working days to get like the basic infantry equipment and assets for a nation done. But that's actually the easiest part, like sculpting rifles and webbing and knapsacks and whatnot. That's pretty easy. The difficult part is rigging up hoses and then also preparing the exporters themselves. I think if this had been an STL only project, it would have been turned around in half the time. But you're putting things into a Blender file and you're cleaning it up. One thing I want to say is I want to apologize to everybody who backed the Napoleonics because those files were very poorly compressed and optimized. It meant like they were taking up like 2 to 3 gigs per file. The current Great War files are about 400 megabytes a file. So learned a lot there. But yes, just tweaks and how to position, organize everything. I think that's actually the bulk of the work. Yes, so I under ideal circumstances, I want to be releasing a Kickstarter every 3 or 4 months, and I have 2 development paths. So the idea is that in a perfect world, as I'm finishing, as I pass the halfway point on one Kickstarter, I launch the next one. So they're kind of alternating releases, and that's partly in pursuit of profit, of course, but also because it's just nice to have a variety of my workload. To be honest, the Napoleonics, very grateful for the support that got. It's the most successful thing I've probably ever done with my life. But after a while, like I joked to you before the recording, you need some variety. You need to change things up a bit. So. I'm currently working on 7 Years' War models. Backers of the last Napoleonic Kickstarter actually got preview versions of those figures, and I'm enjoying that immensely. Both World War One and the 7 Years' War. I'm very happy creatively right now because it's 2 very fun topics. Yeah.
And I imagine without too much effort, some of this stuff could be translated back 50 odd years to the sort of late 19th century Prussian conflicts and Austrian conflicts.
I'm sure we're going to see some Franco-Prussian War conversions. So obviously I think it's just a matter of time that some people have their own sculpting skills. I mean, Robert, you were very self-deprecating about your sculpting earlier, but you might recall that during the World War One project, you actually sent me some World War One figures that you'd sculpted using the Napoleonic assets. So yes, I'm sure someone with some talent will cobble things together. I just ask that they don't then go on to use them as the foundation of products they go on to sell. That's naughty, but
yes,
absolutely. Like
credit the creator.
Credit him with credits, preferably.
Yeah, well, even better. Yes, in whichever currency is popular.
Well, I think people underestimate what it takes, and yes, it's kind of interesting from my perspective to do some of these things, but having dabbled in it in that way, I can really appreciate, the effort that Henry's able to put into it and the creativity as well, and that's difficult to sustain. I think it's unlikely that others would be able to take some of these kind of basic assets and kind of re-engineer them. It could be a little bit interesting for a little while, but no, it's not something you can continue to work at unless you're committed to it and enjoy it. And Henry, those skills that you've developed, you've been able to apply a lot of that to the World War One range, haven't you? You've been able to bring over a number of things which are reusable for a start, but also the processes that you've developed and the understanding of how to position things, etc. All the time you see your ability to generate these figures is getting quicker and better.
Yes, and I think with the 7 Years' War especially, that's going to be quite fast to turn out, I think, considering the crossover with Napoleonics. I do want to say, maybe I overstated my fears the last time I spoke about what copyright or copying, whatever. I think when I first got started in this, I did kind of willfully make a sort of a compact with the community in the sense that I provided these Blender files. It's sort of like a mathematician who shows they're working out, you know. People can go through them. They can basically piece together how I do things. I think a lot of people, myself included, didn't even realize that 3D designs could be multi-part. I'd always assumed that people that sculpted things do it the same way like you would with a single blob of putty or whatever, you know. I didn't realize when I first started designing ships, it blew my mind when I found out Simon Mann very kindly showed me that his ships are all different bits. But what I want to say, yes, I think there is an exercise of trust there, and really, wargamers overall, like, we do care for the hobby, we care for its health. I think most people wish me well, most people very kindly support my work, and they do that because it's a mutually beneficial thing, you know, like the longer I work and the fact that I can actually do it as my sole means of income means more stuff you want to see covered gets covered. A common discussion, and I don't want to derail us too much, but a very common discussion had among 3D creators is how to react to piracy. It's a very pronounced problem for people whose work is, and again, I have to be careful, but let's say derivative of existing intellectual properties. People don't feel so many moral qualms about perhaps spreading that stuff around without paying for it because they think, well, it's already sort of stolen anyway. I've not seen that to anywhere near the same extent in the historical wargaming community. I'm not personally aware of my work ever having been distributed like that, and I'm very grateful for it. What I'm trying to say is I think you can kind of take a positive view of the community and trust them because most of us, we're invested in the hobby and we want that to do well. And I think people appreciate that my work is original and what goes on to make it. So, yeah.
I think from my perspective, I mentioned this, I think, a couple of podcasts ago, about a more traditional manufacturer of terrain, actually, who'd put a post out to say that in the post-COVID, well, we're not post-COVID, but I think you know what I mean, that we're through the worst part of the pandemic and lives are generally returning back to normality. But we're now in sort of a cost of living crisis, and that he's feeling the impact of that. And he put a plea out on his social media to say, please consider buying some of my product. Now, I think an average building in 6mm from him is £3 or £4. So for a £10, you might get 3 buildings, say. And my take on it is that if we as wargamers want the nice things, then we need to put our money in our pockets. And I appreciate that we are in a somewhat of a cost of living crisis at the moment, but what's the pledge levels that we're talking about for this Kickstarter, Henry?
Oh, let me remind myself. I do have
that was a low baller for you. Sorry about that.
It's all right. Just if you want to just get the Western Front STLs by themselves, it's £35, and annoyingly, Kickstarter's amazing design means I can't actually view my own add-ons. So when people write me to ask how much things is, I have to guess almost. But as I remember, each of the STL modules, they're all £35, but there are bundles. Unfortunately, one guy did write me to say he hadn't noticed the bundles and he'd bought everything individually. But I'm still working out how to do that for him. But anyway, yeah, at the bottom there is one that says all STL files, which is 70, so you effectively get one of them for free. So that's a reasonable offer. If you want to get just the Western Front Blender files, that's 15 quid on top of the STL, so it totals at 50. If you want to get everything, like all the STL files and all the Blender files, that's 95. And I know, like, that feels quite steep up front, I guess, if you think £95 for an entire set. But when you consider that, even not counting stretch goals, that's what you get: British infantry, French infantry, Germans, Austrians, Italians, Russians, Anzacs, Ottomans, plus the Blender files, which have all their various toggleables in, and any stretch goals we unlock. I think it works out quite reasonable. And we did do a survey at the end of the Napoleonics, and I did ask about price. most people said they were fair. The thing is, it does represent a saving of when all this actually does get released, because as it should be with any Kickstarter, you're financing a prospective range, right? Something that's in development. And when it does release, I will put them up as individual kits. I'll be selling like 1918 Brits separate from 1914 Brits, and they'll be like $15 a pop. So it does represent a saving. I don't know. I guess I'd put it to Robert. Robert actually purchased the last one, so he's a customer, one with a vested interest now, perhaps. But
Well, from my perspective, particularly as Sean said in the introduction, working with these large historical war game, it's almost like reenactments, I was going to say. You're talking armies of, well, when we did the Battle of the Marne, it was 10,000 figures. So when you're able to print off 10,000 figures from a £90 bundle, yeah, for me it's an absolute no-brainer.
This was the point, really, Henry, that I was getting at. That, and I know Robert mentioned about the negligible cost. Really, once you set up, clearly there's the setup cost of getting the printer, getting the wash thing, and your resin. But once that's out of the way, and you've bought these STLs, then Robert printing off 10,000 figures is going to seem like small fry, isn't it, compared to more traditional routes of buying these figures. So the value is self-evident, I think.
I'd also say it is a valid argument that people make that there's the setup cost, or how to put this online. When you see 3D printing discussions, people ask how many print jobs until I've made back my money. That is a valid argument, but another thing is, again, the figure customization, the level of detail. Like, obviously, it depends on how you feel about how particular materials feel. But like, these are figures which actually have pronounced fingers. As you said, there are visible moustaches. You can see their eyes and things. Like, they're pretty detailed in the all. So I hope that they appeal to people on multiple levels. A lot of the people buying these aren't even 6mm gamers. They do just scale them up, 10mm, 15mm. I do feel it is pushing it to go past 15mm. They do look a bit chunky, but if you have an acquired taste, maybe that's a fine thing. You made your plug earlier to printer manufacturers that you want maybe a deal. I think I'll do the same. Someone's asked me why we don't get these in museums. So if anyone from the Imperial War Museum is listening to this, please get in touch. I'd like that as well.
Maybe we'll send. I can send a link to this episode off to the War Museum, and we'll see where we get with that. But particularly if you've got somebody like, I don't know, maybe Robert Dunlop to paint up 10,000 figures as a display.
I just don't know what's the problem with the connection at the moment.
It's very temperamental. It's very temperamental. But I
tell you what, though, a resin pile is a lot lighter than a lead one.
Yes. They can be just as big, though, can't they? I mean, my lead pile's quite big.
Yeah, they're bigger. They're
bigger, right?
I can tell you. There's a designer, and I know Henry's seen his work, Marcus Bergman, a New Zealander who's produced some wonderful, typically 1/100th scale tanks and other vehicles from both First and Second World Wars. And when I got hold of them, I can print off a whole Russian battalion of T whatevers, and I did. I haven't painted them. I don't know whether I'll ever get around to it, but yeah, it's just as seductive as a lead pile. That's
yeah. And I think this is the point, really, that I've heard the argument, Henry, as you've highlighted there, that how much is this going to cost to set up? But once I've purchased your STL files and printed off my 10,000 figures to recreate the Marne, I can then go and print off the buildings for that. And I can print off some walls and fences, and I can print off a Napoleonic army tomorrow. So
you should be very careful. It's very easy to get impulsive with digital purchases. That is one issue.
Well, also, of course, you can go online and purchase these and be printing your figures off within minutes, as opposed to waiting for that 21 days delivery.
Well, yeah, a lot of Europeans. I hate to bring up the B word, but in a post-Brexit world, a lot of Europeans do tell me that they've come to me because they're sick of waiting on delivery times from Britain. Like postage has got more expensive, and it's with customs things that people like in Germany can run into. Yeah, they've switched to STLs because I'm quite proud to say it, but a lot of miniature manufacturing is done in the UK, and it's more difficult for Europeans now. I don't know about right now. I don't know if they've sorted out the custom stuff by now, but that had been feedback I was getting.
I think you will still find more traditional figure manufacturers still struggling to supply people on the continent because of the various issues. And I know they're trying to find some workarounds around that, but sales from the continent seem to have dropped off markedly for the physical products. So STL files just seem the perfect answer, really, for the European customer.
The other thing that's kind of fun is I'm going to be doing Gallipoli at Joy of Six, and in the grand tradition, as you know, Sean, it will be 3 tables, 4x6, joined together to cover the Battle of Saribea and the landings at Suvla Bay, which happened at the same time and basically in the same geography. So that'll be illustrated. So I can get things like the Beetles, which were the landing craft from other manufacturers. But I got interested in having some of the piers that were built. So I can just get out my 3D software and boom, I've created and printed these landing piers based on original photographs of Gallipoli. And now, of course, with Henry's figures, the Ottomans, Anzacs, and so forth, if folks want to see them, and they're going to be at Joy of Six in Sheffield in, 3rd of July, then by all means come along and have a look, because you'll even get the opportunity to see them painted up.
Am I going crazy, or do I remember you designing a ship as well?
Oh yes, yeah. The main one, which I designed literally from scratch, was the SS River Clyde. Well, actually, we would call it an LTS. It was the landing troops ship, and they basically ran it ashore at V Beach. And so I created a 3D model of it with its holes cut in the hull to be able to allow men to get off, and the machine gun pillboxes, which were created out of sheet metal up on the front, and so on. Yeah, it's great fun. Love it.
Yeah.
I love ships. Ships they're very zen to design. I like them all the figures, if I'm honest.
You put a lot of effort, haven't you, Henry? I've followed you and seen some of the designs that you've come up with for the boats, the big boats.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, if I'm honest, they don't make as much money, but how to say, it's a part of the hobby I feel really needs activity and maintaining. There's not so many people doing it, so I enjoy it. We do it on the Patreon, yeah.
Have we got boats in this Kickstarter? Have we got a monitor? Can I see?
Yes, there is one. It's the bottom left, coastal motor boat there, I remember. But and I think we did have one for Gallipoli. Yeah, M-class monitor is £19,000 there. So yeah, there are two naval things. Oh, and we got British naval infantry, but that's for 1914 Western Front, I think, isn't it? When they're still dressed as sailors. So.
I have to say, Henry, one of the least surprising things of this spreadsheet that you've sent with the Great War stretch goals is the Gallipoli element. with Robert's involvement. I thought that's.
Oh, no, how could you have guessed that?
It's this in a telepathy, I think.
If a very kind gentleman is going to help you for free print off samples for a lovely podcast personality, you have to bribe him a little. You know?
Well, I mean, it looks really comprehensive, and the whole thing does. And I've mentioned this many times before, probably both to yourselves and elsewhere, that I am endlessly fascinated by this technology. But still yet to dip my toe, and it will happen. It will happen. It's only a matter of time. It's when, not if.
To anyone listening now, please, could you write in the comments if you would like Sean to release a series where he gives you updates every day of his various print catastrophes, how he's muddling through.
Yeah, it would be muddling through as well, absolutely.
Everybody is. Everybody is to begin with.
Yeah, I'm no scientist, so the idea of chemicals and printing and lasers just baffles me. But I am endlessly fascinated, and obviously I've got the evidence in front of me, which I will post some pictures up across my various social medias of these, because I've been stunned by the quality. Okay, so we're sitting around about £10,500, Henry, at the moment, aren't we? And clearly the sky's the limit for how high that can go, but I think we've got stretch goals out to £25,000. That would be a nice number to hit, wouldn't it?
Technically 40,000, but that's on the early access column there, which I'm not really expecting to get funded. We introduced.
There's a challenge for you, listeners. There's a challenge for you.
Reverse psychology, right? Don't pledge. We introduced that with the last Kickstarter because people were keen to get me working on the 7 Years' War, and that one actually did unlock. I think that was a 25k goal, something like that. So I mentioned that we have 7 Years' War figures in circulation. That's how that happened. And unfortunately, Sean, I know you just finished a project, but so this might not be of interest to you, but the early access goal there is for the American War of Independence at 25.
Oh, yeah, you're right. That's come just at the wrong time.
That's my passion project. That's where I can be the Robert Dunlop for myself there.
Okay,
yeah. But away from that, yes, in a practical sense, the limit is 26k if you want the coastal motorboat. Personally, maybe I shouldn't shoot myself in the foot with a lack of ambition, but I'll be happy if we can at least hit 16,000, because that's when all the artillery's sorted. And I think when we have a set that has infantry and artillery, that's at least good bare bones World War One. But I know some of the people following this project will want the cavalry. That's a bit further down.
Well, if every person that downloads this episode goes in and buys one STL at £35 and the associated blender for £15, so pledges £50, then you will blast 50 total. You will blast through. So there is a challenge for every listener to help Henry out. He's obviously slumming it at the moment somewhere in Mexico. He's not quite sure where he is. He's inside a bag, but I think he's safe. I think he's safe. But is there anything else you'd like to tell the listener about, Henry or Robert, about the project or anything coming up in the future?
I guess I would say to anyone who isn't familiar with my work, please, I don't know if Sean can post the link or whatever, but take a look at my prospective release schedule. You can see maybe if World War I's not your bag, there might be something nice coming along. Essentially for me, I am working on this. Obviously, yes, I want to make money. I want to maintain my standard of living out here in the developing world. But I want to keep doing it. But that plan there really is, well, it's just my passion. It's everything that I want to fulfill. I want to be able to, like, maybe if this doesn't last forever, things sort of taper down a bit. I at least want to know that I covered most of that stuff, because in the same way, it's like, I'm sure a lot of you can empathize when you're painting your models and you might have a film. Let's say you're doing Napoleon, you have Waterloo playing in the background, or you listen to some period music, or whatever. You know, it's a kind of cathartic escapism, right? for me, 3D modeling is exactly that. I get to read about this stuff. I put the images in Blender that I'm copying from, and it's historical immersion. I'm a history graduate. I love it. So I guess all I'm saying is, yeah, if the Great War's not your thing, just look at the other stuff I want to cover, because I'm not going anywhere. I want to work on this stuff, keep it going. But for those of you that are familiar with my work and have stuck with it, I can only say thank you so much. Both the people that return to this Kickstarter, but also just the people who give the words of moral support and whatnot. Because I need the reassurance from time to time that I'm not crazy, I suppose, and that I'm actually serving a practical purpose. Because I'll tell you what, where I am right now, there are a lot of remote workers, a lot of self-described entrepreneurs, and when they're talking about their various, I don't know, SEO, marketing kind of things, they're like, oh, what do you do? And I say, I design toys. The sideways looks I get. I need the confirmation that I serve a useful purpose in society, or at least more useful perhaps than someone doing SEO. Oh God, I put my foot in it again.
Well, from my perspective, Henry, I doff my virtual cap towards you, because to follow a passion like you have over the last couple of years or so, with such vigor that you have, the energy that you put into these Kickstarters is inspiring. And I think as each iteration of each Kickstarter comes along, you're clearly honing your art as you develop your skills designing these figures and producing what the wargamer wants. And I will just repeat the comment I made, that if you want nice things, and the wargamer has to support people like Henry in these endeavours to keep on going, because they are quite tremendous. Anything from yourself, Robert, to finish with? I know we're going to be catching up at the Joy of Six in, crikey, about 5 weeks' time, I think.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to it. The only thing I would add is that there's been mention of the Discord group that Henry's set up, and for anyone not familiar with Discord, it's a collaborative kind of website where you can chat, and Henry shares his kind of roadmap and work, and others show off their painting skills and so forth. But what's really important about it is that if somebody is interested in getting into 3D printing, there's a wonderful community that have been there and done that, and they've got the t-shirts with some of the failures that can happen, and they're great, they're wonderful, they're really supportive to anybody who's kind of not sure and wants to get maybe a little bit more background to it, or you buy your first printer and you want to try to hone your skills on that. It's a great group to support that as well. So that's something that isn't so obvious with the Kickstarter.
It's a lovely community, and I will take 1 minute to quickly address this in case anyone's listening and didn't even realize it happened. But back in January, Facebook deleted our community group and gave absolutely no reason why it happened. And this group that had 1,000 members in it, which was actually quite active, just disappeared. And a lot of people who were in it never even realized it happened. I would imagine there might even be some people who think they're still in it and just think the group's gone quiet. But we did make another one, and it is, unfortunately, it's not as active as the old one used to be, but that's largely in part because we moved to Discord, because we realized, I realized, that some arbitrary decision can just completely strip you of your means to communicate with your community. Like, I didn't even have a way to tell people what had happened. I got concerned emails over a few weeks asking if something had happened to me. This Discord emerged out of that, and it's a community that I moderate and I can control. I mean, to a reasonable extent, but that's where most of the activity happens now. So maybe if you were following on Facebook and you wondered what happened to that group or why the current group isn't so busy, it's because most people who are discussing and posting things, it is over on there, and it's a highlight of my morning. Especially with this time difference now, I turn on my computer, I see these notifications, and there's always something nice that's been written, or someone who wants to show some things they painted. Some really beautiful 7 Years War figures from James Tozer at the moment. That's making me want to crack on with those. But yeah, World War One for now, of course. Yeah.
Excellent. So I will post up a link to Discord, the Discord channel, if that's okay with you, Henry, and
Yes, of course.
we'll encourage people to visit there, because it sounds like a great space to share the passion for your work and the hobby in general. Okay, gentlemen. Well, it's as usual. It's been fantastic to speak to you. I'm not going to ask either of you for a book for the virtual library, but I will hold you though to the there's usually two pledges I ask for from guests. One is for a book for the virtual library, but the other is that you will both return at some point in the near future. And Henry, I feel like we may be opening up some lines of communication very soon for the next production from Turner Miniatures.
Oh yeah, I mean, if I miss grabbing you for the AWI, I'm definitely going to grab you for the 7 Years War, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to have you back on for that. So, Henry, all the best for the future and for this Kickstarter, which has got, well, it will have 6 days left by the time I put this up. So it is the 26th of May now. It'll go up tomorrow morning, the 27th. So we'll have 6 days to run. Let's see how high we can get that total. And see what you can unlock for Henry to start panicking about sculpting and getting these things done. I'm guessing the turnaround is going to be pretty quick, as it, Henry, it usually is, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. This time I'm just trying to think. I have got the roadmap public, so you can actually see everything I've worked on already. But of the stretch goals that have already been unlocked, everything that's related to heads has been done. And I'm just cracking on with the extra STLs now. But yes, I don't want to get too preemptive, but with let's say it hits about 16,000, I think about 2 months from now is when everything will be completed.
That's a pretty good turnaround. So all the best with that, Robert. As usual, it's been great to speak to you and hear your input into this project, and I very much look forward to catching up with you at the Euro 6.
Yeah, looking forward to it, Sean.
Yeah. Okay, gents. Well, thanks very much, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks,
thank
Sean.
you very much for having us.
Yes.
And thank you, Robert, as well. I just want to say that publicly. You've just been of amazing help with this.
Pleasure, Henry.
I want that on the record. So yeah.
happy canvas bag travelling.
Brother Bertie went away to do his bit the other day. With a smile on his lips and his left hand and pips upon his shoulder, bright and gay. As the train moved out, he said, "Remember me to all the birds." Then he wagged his paw and went away to war, shouting out these pathetic words. Goodbye, goodbye, oh, I'm so dear, baby dear, from your eye. Though it's hard to part, I know, I'll be tickled to death to go. Don't cry, don't sigh, there's a silver lining in the sky. Bonsoir, oh, sin, cheerio, chin, chin, na, boo, toodaloo, goodbye. At the concert down at Kew, some convalescent dressed in blue had to hear Lady Lee, who had turned 83, sing all the old songs she knew. Then she made a speech and said, "I look upon you boys with pride, and for what you've done I'm going to kiss each one." Then they all grabbed their sticks and cried, "Goodbye, goodbye, oh, and a dear baby dear from your eye. Though it's hard to part, I know, I'll be tickled to death to go. Don't cry, don't sigh, there's a silver lining in the sky. Bonsoir, oh, sing, cheerio, chin, chin, na, boo, toodaloo, goodbye." Little Private Patrick saw he was the prisoner of war, till the Hun with the gun called him pig dog for fun, and Paddy punched him on the door. Right across the barbed wire fence The German dropped in dear, oh dear. All the while gave away and tried to yell, hooray, as he ran for the Dutch frontier. Goodbye, oh, wipes a dear baby dear from your eye. Though it's hard to pass, I know. I'll be single and it's to go. Don't cry. There's a silver lining in the sky. But for whole thing, cheerio,